Good morning, I'm Greg Krasovsky. I'm an attorney and a former police officer, and today I wanted to talk to you about criminal law services that my law offices offer to people in the United States, in Russia, other countries of the former Soviet Union, and in other countries around the world. First and foremost, I represent, with my colleagues, victims of crime. So you would say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean? Why would a victim of a crime need a lawyer? Very straightforward. You need to make sure, if you're a victim of a crime, whether it's a crime of violence, a property crime, any other type of economic crime, you need to make sure that, first of all, you understand exactly what criminal statutes were violated against you. And you need to make sure that the law enforcement agencies do their job as well as they can. The prosecutors do their job, and the court system gives you justice as a victim. So why would you need a lawyer? Well, first of all, often local police departments, even federal police agencies or law enforcement agencies, can be understaffed, underfunded, overwhelmed by crimes. They may decline to investigate or to prosecute cases based on these constraints. The same thing goes for prosecutors, both on the local and federal level. Often without a proper advocate, in other words, an attorney, the local prosecutor may ignore your case or not give it the attention that it requires. Same thing could happen during the court process, during the prosecution of an individual who's committed a crime against you. So our job is to make sure that, number one, each part of the criminal justice system, including law enforcement, prosecutors, the court system, does their job without violating your rights, with respect to your rights, and prosecutes people to the fullest extent under the law. Make sure that you're also compensated if you're entitled to compensation as a crime victim. Number two, because we're facing financial constraints, it's called judicial economy, you also want to make sure that our law offices can provide the necessary assistance to local law enforcement, to local prosecutors, in identifying the people who've committed a crime against you, gathering all the evidence that's required to prosecute them. And sometimes when law enforcement and prosecutors do not have all the resources at their disposal that they can give your case, it's helpful when your lawyer can assist them. Obviously, this is assistance within what the law allows, but that assistance can be effective, especially if my law office can also, if necessary, bring in private investigators. In the case of economic crimes, forensic accountants, auditors, other experts that may be required or may be useful to gather evidence against those who committed a crime against you. Another area that we help people on is to make sure that they're in compliance with local laws, both domestic and international, and do not inadvertently violate laws that could lead to criminal liability. In other words, a situation can arise where a law-abiding citizen, in the course of their travels abroad or work abroad, or even work with foreign countries, can inadvertently run afoul of local criminal laws and be subject to prosecution. And as you know, in this area, as they say, ignorance of the law is no excuse. So sometimes if you're confronted by something like this, saying, hey, I didn't know it was a crime, that's not going to cut it. It's your responsibility to know what's a crime and what's not a crime. And often for that, you'll need the services of a lawyer. Often you can't find everything on the internet, as crazy as that may sound. So we provide legal services to victims of crimes to make sure that they're treated properly by law enforcement, by prosecutors, by the court system, to make sure that we can give assistance to prosecutors and law enforcement if necessary. We also provide services to individuals who want to make sure that they don't inadvertently violate local laws. and foreign laws when it comes to criminal liability. And we also provide services to people who have been either wrongfully accused of committing a crime or are facing selective prosecution or persecution, or are facing punishment that's disproportionate to the crime that they have committed. Or the local criminal justice system is ignoring certain extenuating circumstances that they should not ignore. We've had cases both in the US and in other countries where people have been accused of crimes, arrested for crimes. They've also had criminal charges pressed against them. They've been indicted. And sometimes there were not just extenuating circumstances, but other circumstances that call into question whether a crime had been committed at all. Because remember, in order to commit a crime, you have to have the requisite criminal intent, right? So the criminal state of mind, right? And if you don't have that, then you may not have committed a crime. So these are issues that you may need help on. I work with local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, prosecutors, and local legal counsel, local attorneys in jurisdictions all around the world. If you already have a local lawyer, but you feel you can benefit from my expertise, especially as an attorney and a former police officer, and you're not going to find too many people that, you know, received an education at Columbia University for undergraduate, went to school, University of Pennsylvania Law School, and also have real life police experience. And for many years since that time, since I've attended those schools, I've done a lot of work with local law enforcement on behalf of my clients, on behalf of organizations that I work with. So I can put all that experience and skills to use in helping protect your rights. What you don't want to end up being is a statistic within the criminal justice system, both as a victim or as a potential suspect, because the consequences can be devastating. We've had cases where people were victims of crimes, and local law enforcement, because they were either understaffed or they had really fairly poor investigative techniques or supervision, failed to gather critical evidence, both physical evidence and witness testimony. And because of that, they weren't able to get justice for victims. They weren't able to either identify suspects or to properly prosecute suspects. The other thing you really need to be aware of as a victim of a crime is, especially in the US, but not just this, it happens all around the world. Often suspects enter into plea agreements with either local law enforcement or local prosecutors. And because of those plea agreements, they end up getting a fairly good deal considering what they did, considering the crime that they committed. And who pays the price? The victim, because the victim doesn't get justice. Imagine the following situation. Let's say someone committed a violent crime against you. Assault, simple assault, aggravated assault, rape, other violent crime. And they were arrested, and you think that these people are going to be prosecuted to the fullest extent permitted by law. Little did you know that this individual ended up entering into a plea agreement with a local prosecutor because the prosecutor just doesn't have the time to prosecute something like this. Or this individual had a very good criminal defense attorney. Or he was able to provide information to local law enforcement. In other words, become either a confidential informant or another source of information for law enforcement. Often people call snitches. And instead of getting 3, 4, 5, 6 years for the crimes committed against you, that individual gets a slap on the wrist. And you're left having to deal with all the injuries and all the damage that was done to you, including both psychological and things like that. So this is why it's important to have a lawyer, to make sure that you don't become a statistic as a victim. As someone who has been accused of a crime or arrested for a crime, if you didn't do it, don't think that you'll be able to prove your innocence, especially if you only use a public defender. Especially if you're young or you happen to be a minority, or within some sort of socio-economic or ethnic group against whom there are stereotypes or prejudice at work in the criminal justice system or by law enforcement. Public defenders are overworked, underpaid, and they don't have the time to devote or the resources to devote to proper representation of their clients. So if you can, make sure that you also have access to a private attorney, even if you have to borrow money, because you don't want to end up a statistic where the book is thrown at you and you're serving the amount of time that's disproportionate to your crime, especially if you haven't committed the crime or you didn't know it was a crime. I mean, you had a legitimate good faith reason not knowing, and you didn't have this requisite criminal state of mind. You also don't want to be made an example of. There is selective prosecution working for various types of crimes in various jurisdictions for reasons, political reasons, especially around election times. Everyone likes every politician or people running for office, and not just usual political office. Imagine if someone's running for re-election as a district attorney or a local prosecutor, or someone is running for re-election, if this is permitted by the laws of your state or your jurisdiction, as a judge. Think about that. You have prosecutors who run for election as judges after having worked as prosecutors, and they want to make sure that they look tough on crime. So instead of getting probation or a suspended sentence or a minimal sentence, imagine if that individual who's running for office decides to make an example out of it. Bad news. So this is another reason why you need legal counsel, competent and experienced legal counsel, especially who understands how law enforcement and prosecutors work. And this doesn't just apply to work in the United States, to criminal matters in the U.S., but in other countries, especially in developing or third world countries, or any country where you could be facing hostility or harsh treatment because you're a foreigner who's committed a crime. Often, no matter where you are, if you're a foreigner and you committed a crime, don't think that the criminal justice system is going to kind of let you off the hook because you're from somewhere else and you didn't know what was happening. Often they may make an example of you because they don't want foreigners committing crimes, regardless if the foreigners there legally or illegally. Well, if you're an illegal alien, or you're having issues with your immigration status in any country, or you're illegally employed, that's bad news, especially if you're facing any type of accusation of having committed an economics crime. For instance, violations of customs laws, violation of money laundering laws, currency controls, local consumer protection laws, laws for licensing and certification of equipment or services that you sell. People don't realize that in a number of jurisdictions, civil slander and libel are actually criminal statutes. So if you make a statement against someone that that individual considers to be false and derogatory or inflammatory, instead of just facing a civil lawsuit, they could have criminal charges initiated against you. Think about this. And you may not have been in that country. You may have simply just given an interview to a journalist from that country or had that statement published within the local press or in local social media. So in today's global economy, especially with internet publications, internet mass media, with social media, whatever you say, whatever you do, could have legal ramifications for you around the globe. Speaking of criminal victims, when it comes to cyberspace, if you're a victim of someone who's cyber stalking you, who is what they call trolling you on the internet or on social media, harassing you, intimidating you, or someone you know, your loved one, your children, make sure you give us a call. We'll help you protect your legal rights. And we'll try to do everything within our power to put this illegal activity to an end, because that can have devastating consequences. We've all heard of too many examples where young people, especially teenagers, have been so harassed and intimidated by things that have been said about them in social media or on the internet that they've tried to commit suicide. Some have committed suicide, and those are tragedies. Or people pick up destructive habits because of depression. They start abusing alcohol, drugs. They start having disciplinary problems in school or drop out of school whatsoever, altogether. They may have problems with work. So this is another area why we enjoy representing victims of crimes, and not just certain civil offenses. A good example would be sexual harassment at work. In some jurisdictions, certain things, certain types of sexual harassment could actually be qualified as crimes. And in those cases where it's appropriate, criminal prosecution is warranted. And if you're a victim, we'll help you get justice. If you're unfairly or falsely accused of sexual harassment or any other type of crime, date rape, indecent contact, indecent exposure, other things, feel free to call us as well, because as an attorney, I want to make sure that innocent people do not suffer consequences for crimes that they did not commit. And within any criminal justice system, we also need to make sure that the burden of proof falls on the state and its prosecutors. Countries like the US, right, there's the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. In other countries, there are different types of standards. But let's make sure that the prosecutors do their job, proving your guilt, especially if you're not guilty. And you don't want to end up facing consequences for a crime that you didn't commit. So that's about it. For criminal law, both domestically and internationally, feel free to give us a call. We'll try to help you out ourselves, also in conjunction with local counsel, with help from local private investigators, with help from local law enforcement, local prosecutors, and also with help from consular officials. If you're someone who's being accused of a crime abroad or a victim of a crime abroad, remember, you're also entitled to consular assistance from your country's embassy, from your country's consulate. And I have extensive experience of working with consulates of various countries to make sure that they do everything within their power to protect their citizens who are either victims of crime or who are suspects for having committed crimes. I guess another area that I didn't bring up, but we should because it often affects people, are immigration consequences. So, for instance, if you're in another country, either as a visitor or as an immigrant, or, and it does happen, as an illegal alien, someone who's either overstayed their visa, entered the country illegally, may have committed visa fraud. In other words, when you applied for a visa, you made misrepresentations of material fact on your visa application or to consular officials who interviewed you. If you're facing criminal charges for other things in that country, these could have certain immigration consequences for you. You could be detained, deported. You could face a bar to entry into that particular country for a number of years, if not permanently. If you're someone who's a victim of a crime, and that crime was committed by a foreigner, whether as a visitor, an immigrant, or let's say someone who's on a tourist or on a student visa or a work visa, and you want to make sure that that person faces justice and is not able to avoid justice by simply fleeing to their home jurisdiction, give us a call. so we can try to help you out, so we can work with local law enforcement and prosecutors to make sure that the foreign suspect doesn't just get a slap on the wrist. And we've seen this happen. People do fall through the cracks or are able to abuse the process and escape criminal liability. Thank you. Look forward to hearing from you.